All right, A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. I'm so excited to be doing this video because the year is 2018. I have not done a new video in 2 years. Fortunately, I guess they're finally coming after me. I violated some copyright laws apparently with my earlier song that I used before, so now I have to do a whole new video. And so technology is a little bit different than it was a couple years ago, so bear with me. But I'm excited to be back. There he is, Andrew Jackson. There's good and bad in everybody, and unfortunately for him, he has mostly bad in him. There's a little picture, a little cartoon of him. Anybody else care to discuss politics with a gun? He was a tough person, tough president. We'll talk about him. Some other key topics in Chapter 13A include the elections of 1824 and 1828. New democracy is an important topic we'll get to, and the Tariff of Abominations. And I get to finally talk about somebody who I really don't like. Fire up, go Eagles. All right, first section of 13A, politics for the people. The key term in this slide is new democracy. We'll get to that in a second. So let's start on the top here. Politicians were supposed to favor the voting masses. Okay. However, the politicians were mostly the leading men of this time period, and even today to some degree. In the West, the chief qualification to be elected to politics was typically a superior military commander, somebody that was successful against Native Americans, and Andrew Jackson is that person, and he was very popular. William Henry Harrison as well from Indiana, another military commander that became very successful in politics. But in the early 1800s, still the leading politicians, the people in charge, were the leading citizens, the best people. However, this is very important in A-Push. We are seeing a change in the mid-1820s. So maybe you want to jot this down. In the mid-1820s, there's a change where the common man is starting to have more power in government in the United States. And this idea is called new democracy. Okay? New democracy is a shift to seeing more of the common man being able to vote. Because in the 1820s, states were dropping the property requirements in order to vote. So basically, in order to vote, all you had to do was be a male, and you could vote in most elections in the 1820s. So the shift to voting by the common man is what new democracy is, and it's very important. Okay, what helped cause this new democracy? The increase in the amount of people that can vote? Well, partly it was caused by the market economy, and this develops really after the War of 1812, kind of fueled by the Industrial Revolution, and the nation is starting to really value selling goods at the market. Okay, trading goods, growing crops, selling them at the market instead of just feeding your family becomes very important. So more people are getting involved in the political system. More people are wanting the chance to vote. Panic of 1819 caused many farmers especially to blame their issues on the banking system, on the bus. So this is a reason why people wanted more of a say in voting. The Missouri Compromise, especially for the South, showed the importance of politics and to protect the institution of slavery. So more and more people are being able to vote during the 1820s because of new democracy, getting rid of land requirements. Not only are more people voting, more people are going out to the polls. The increase in voter participation is dramatic. Only 25% of eligible people, that was Miggy, only 25% of eligible people voted in 1824. It doubled to 50% 4 years later, which we'll get to these two elections today. And then by 1840, the election of 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler II election of William Henry Harrison, over 3/4 of all Americans who were eligible voted. So politics becomes extremely important during this time period in the 1820s and 1830s. In addition to the increase in voter turnout, there are new methods for nominating presidential candidates, and these are called national conventions, which we still have today. Every 4 years during the presidential election season, usually in August or September, the political parties have national conventions. People go there, and that's where the presidential candidate is introduced. Typically, they select their vice president as well. It's a way to get their political party excited for the election in November. And this idea was created in 1831. Again, it gave more power to the people in terms of who their presidential candidate would be. All right, now we get into some good history. This next section is the Adams-Clay corrupt bargaining. That's the title of it. And the main event, we're going to call this the corrupt bargain. Okay, and so it's all about the election of 1824. And we have these four people: Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and John Quincy Adams. So four candidates. And what's interesting, in this election, all four people are said to be Democratic Republicans. Now, back in history, they actually call themselves Republicans. But as historians, we try to call the early Republicans the Democratic Republicans so they don't get confused with the current Republicans in the 21st century. So the Democratic Republicans, these are all four DRs. And so they all want to become president. And so this election is extremely controversial. It's one of the most important ones in U.S. history. And there's a lot of confusion in this election. For example, John C. Calhoun, who I'm not a fan. He actually was the vice president for both Adams and Andrew Jackson. It's so confusing. Again, it's kind of a weird election. But what we need to know is this. Okay, after the Electoral College, the votes are passed and the people vote. Jackson won the popular vote he had 42% of the popular vote, but he did not have enough electoral votes. So in American political history or political policy, you have to have a majority of electoral votes to become president. Andrew Jackson, who had the most popular votes, who had the most votes, did not have a majority electoral votes. So now, if this happens, it goes to the House of Representatives. They're the ones that are going to decide who the president is going to be. So the election of 1824, again, that's what we're talking about, is going to be decided in the House of Representatives. Now, of the four people, the one who that was, they always drop the fourth person in terms of amount of votes, and that was Henry Clay. So Henry Clay is off the ballot. So it comes down to John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Crawford. And Crawford is a non-factor. He drops out. So now it's down to two. John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State during the previous 8 years, and Old Hickory from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson. And again, Andrew Jackson, he won the popular vote, or he had the most votes, so a lot of people said he should have been president. However, the House of Representatives is important. They select John Quincy Adams as president. And of course, Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, is going nuts, says that it's terrible, he should win. And it comes down to Henry Clay. Okay, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, okay, and he really had a lot of power in the House of Representatives. Henry Clay told his fellow members of the House to support John Quincy Adams. So Clay is so important in getting John Quincy Adams elected as president. Of course, who is very upset about this? Andrew Jackson is very mad at Henry Clay. But Jackson gets even more upset when later is found out that Henry Clay is going to become John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson and his people cry this was a corrupt bargain, that John Quincy Adams promised Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State if the House of Representatives selected Q Adams. Now, we're not 100% sure if there was this corrupt bargain, but regardless, Henry Clay does become the Secretary of State and John Quincy Adams becomes the president. Last bit of A-Push trivia, just be careful, just know this. If people ask, if it's ever asked on an exam, who decided the 1824 election, the answer is the House of Representatives. They selected the president, not the corrupt bargain, although we'd call this the corrupt bargain election of 1824, and Andrew Jackson is not happy. All right, now we can talk about the presidency of John Quincy Adams, who frankly changed over time. I never used to be a big fan of John Quincy Adams, but over time I've kind of respected him in a lot of ways. He wrote the Monroe Doctrine. After becoming president, he goes back to become a member of the House of Representatives, which is crazy because most presidents would think that's beneath them. And John Quincy Adams, this man right here with beautiful sideburns, is one of the leading abolitionists. He wants to end slavery in the United States. But his presidency, unfortunately, was not successful. He's considered one of the worst presidents. Very few events went his way. A lot of members of Congress were against him, especially because of how Jackson lost the election. So in terms of events, the major event we'll get to in a little bit is probably the Tariff of Abominations. But otherwise, not a very promising presidency. It only lasted one term. He was only president for 4 years because somebody wanted revenge on him. And you guessed it, who got his revenge? Andrew Jackson. All right, so this is probably the big event for John Quincy Adams, and it's actually in his last year as president, called the Tariff of Abominations. This is a must-know. Okay, this is a major event. Highlight this, very important, in 1828. So we know that tariff began with Alexander Hamilton in the early 1790s as a form of government revenue. The tariff becomes important in 1816. It becomes protective, the protective tariff to help manufacturing. So the tariff rates are gradually increasing, but they really increase in 1828. Okay, the rate goes from 25 to 37%. Do you have to memorize that? I don't know. Just know that this was a very high tariff, and it really upset the South. This is a must-know. The South and farmers hated the tariff. It always cost them more money because they had to buy more expensive manufactured goods. And with higher tariffs, they're less likely to sell their crops to other countries. So the South hated the tariff. The Northeast, New England, was big in manufacturing, and they loved the tariff. So this tariff makes many Southerners and people in the West really upset with John Quincy Adams, and it really becomes the key issue in the election of 1828, and Andrew Jackson wants his revenge against John Quincy Adams. Does he get it? I believe so. All right, continuing this section, there's South Carolina. John C. Calhoun, I can't wait to tell more about him down the road. But anyway, John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, hate the tariff. They're against it, very vocal, very upset about this. Some thought that the North is really exhibiting their power in Congress. If they keep getting the higher tariff, eventually they might try to abolish slavery. So they are mad about the tariff. It hurts their economy, could lead to something bigger. And again, many Southerners, especially South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, are big into states' rights. They thought the federal power was becoming too powerful with the tariff. Weird side note, we've talked about some slave revolts before. In 1822, there's the Denmark Vesey. You have to know a couple of slave revolts during this time period before the Civil War called Antebellum America. And one is 1822, and it's down here. It's in South Carolina, and actually I went, there was a memorial in Charleston, South Carolina. I went over spring break in 2018, and I visited this memorial. It's very controversial, and he was a free black, and he tried to incite a slave revolt in South Carolina against the slave owners. It failed. In fact, the slave revolt never even happened. Somebody told many of the leaders, the white leaders of Charleston, about it. So Denmark Vesey was captured and then executed, and the slave revolt never happened. Although he tried to eventually lead one, it never did occur. So just notice this little table here of the major slave revolts in North America. We've seen Stonewall before. Maybe you remember New York City. Almost all of them are suppressed. Very few of them work in terms of trying to help free more slaves. And the big one, which we'll get to later, is going to be the Nat Turner Rebellion, and that's in chapter 17. All right, we're going to continue talking about the tariff then. This is the next section. So we kind of talk about this a lot. The Southerners despise the tariff. So in the textbook, the author, David Kennedy, Stanford University, basically talks about a shoemaker, how tariffs cause the price of shoes to increase. So Southerners have to pay more than they should have for a pair of shoes, and it's making the northern manufacturers a lot more wealthier, which bothers them. And because prices are going up, the South is going to sell less cotton to the British because prices are too high. So the South, number one, has to pay more for manufactured goods. And then number two, as a producer, they're not going to sell as much of their product, and then they are hurt both ways. So the South hated the tariff because things were more expensive, manufactured goods, and they cannot sell as much of their cotton because of higher prices. So again, the tariff is a huge issue for Southerners. They're against the tariff, they are against the bus, and they're against a stronger federal government. And that doesn't even count the issue of slavery, how the Southerners want to keep slavery because it is their way of life. Wait, there's more. There is more about the tariff, and there he is. Oh, my goodness, John C. Calhoun, Charleston, South Carolina. Look at him. Man, he needs a hug. You need a hug, don't you, John C. Calhoun? My goodness, why do you hate so much? Why in your heart? Why don't you find some joy, find peace and love, empathy for others? You did not have that. All right, so let's talk about his role in the Tariff of Abominations. Now, he is the vice president of the time for John Quincy Adams, and ironically, or interesting enough, John C. Calhoun is going to be the vice president for Andrew Jackson after the 1828 election. And John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, they hate the tariff. Hang on, I'm getting a call from Holly Beamer. All right, I'm back. That was not Holly Beamer. That was Mom Beamer. Love her too. All right, so getting back to John C. Calhoun. So in 1828, again, he is vice president for Q. Adams. He hates the Tariff of Abominations. He writes anonymously the South Carolina Exposition. Okay, so nobody knows it's him. He's calling for a nullification. We've seen this word before with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. A nullification of the tariff by all states. Now, in this letter, okay, it's an anonymous letter. Okay, he's calling for nullification to not follow it. Now, nothing ever really came out of this. South Carolina, they're the only state that considered it, and nothing ever really happened. But it is a call. It's another seed being planted of South Carolina and people in the South being against the tariff. And partly why he kind of backed down with this nullification is because Jackson does win the election of 1828, and Calhoun, being a Southerner with a forced slavery like Jackson, backs away. But eventually, Calhoun and Jackson go to blows. Can't wait to talk about that. Okay, the final slide for Chapter 13A. Going whole hog for Jackson in 1828. This is about the election of 1828. And for 4 years, Andrew Jackson was campaigning against John Quincy Adams. Again, he felt cheated out of the 1824 election. He had more popular votes. The corrupt bargain bothered him. So he was ready to win. And he was a fighter. Again, I said he's a tough president. We'll talk more about his toughness later in our class. But during this 4-year period between the two elections, the Democratic Republicans are divided. And they actually form two political parties. One is the National Republicans of John Quincy Adams and the Democrats of Andrew Jackson. Now, the National Republicans never elect a president. Okay, in 1828, Adams, running for re-election, is a National Republican, but he does not win. The Democrats, though, the Democratic Party is founded by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, and so the Democrats of today began with Andrew Jackson. I'm sure Democrats are not probably too excited about that one. All right, so let's talk about the election of 1828. Okay, so in this election, there was major mudslinging, even more than previous elections. John Quincy Adams, people labeled Jackson's mother a prostitute. Wow, harsh words. Even more cutting, if you will, Mickey just barked, is John Quincy Adams attacked Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel. Now, got some issues with this guy, but something about Rachel Jackson, I think she's got a big heart. I think I like her. But John Quincy Adams said that Jackson's wife, Rachel, was not officially divorced from her first marriage when she married Andrew Jackson back in the 1790s. So basically, they accused Rachel Jackson of having two husbands, polygamy or bigamy, whichever you want to call that. And so basically, it crushed Rachel Jackson, and she died before Jackson won the presidency, and Andrew Jackson blamed John Quincy Adams for her death because Rachel died of a broken heart. On the flip side, Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, did not hold back on his mudslinging accusations against John Quincy Adams. He said that Adams used large sums of money from the government and used a servant girl for the mistress of a Russian nobleman. So basically, Andrew Jackson called John Quincy Adams a pimp. He was pimping for the Russians. The Russians are back in the news and even in the 2000s. All right, lastly, Jackson wins the election of 1828, and he wins rather convincingly, partly because of New Democracy, because of the common man voting for Andrew Jackson. And in Chapter 13b, we'll go into Andrew Jackson's presidency in detail. Fire up, go Eagles. Fired up, ready to go.